Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I've gotten a lot of requests recently to do some bank fishing videos and provide some shore fishing tips. And I'm not sure if a lot of you are aware of this, but that's kind of how I grew up. All the way up until my early 20s when I was able to afford my first boat, I did a ton of bank fishing. When I was a younger child, we used to take trips all the time to fish lots of small streams where we would just wade for river smallmouth. We would go for miles upon miles. And it was very evident at even that early age that there were very specific sweet spots. And I think that's something as a angler, you kind of take you learn a much harder lesson how there is a ton of dead water because a lot of times you may have accessible water to fish, but that accessible water a lot of times is not very productive at all. So you have to be really willing to work at being able to generate a lot of bites from shore. Now, I did that when I was younger. When I was in college, we used to shore fish around the Wisconsin River pretty much almost every day. There'd be a group of us in college that would go and just hit river spots all over the place. And we were pretty fortunate being in the Stevens Point, Wisconsin area. We could shore fish all over the place. There are a ton of parks, miles upon miles, honestly, of public water that we could reach, whether it's fishing a bunch of the dams or fishing a bunch of the like bike paths and parkland that run around a bunch of the rivers in this area. We were very fortunate, and I think that's one of the reasons why we did so much of it, because we could go fish new areas on a very regular basis. In my opinion, that's one thing that hinders a lot of bank fishermen is depending where you're located, there's not a ton of fishable water. You have the ability to go find water, but a lot of times it's not accessible to the public, or at least it's not supposed to be accessible. It doesn't mean some guys don't do it, and it's not like I haven't done it before. I've sneaked into a few golf courses and gotten thrown out when I was younger, so I'm totally familiar with that. But when you are stuck only fishing from the bank, you're limited to the water that is accessible to you. And that's honestly like the first and most important tip that I can provide to anybody is to do your due diligence and research in terms of identifying places that you can fish. If you just happen to drive around looking for spots, a lot of times you're missing a lot of the good water in your area. For me, I love to look at aerial photographs. I get on Google Earth, I get on different map programs, and I'm constantly looking at the different waterways that are in my area, whether that's rivers or streams or ponds, retention ponds. It could be old quarries, pretty much everything. And when you start identifying where that water is, you can then start looking at different maps and different websites that show you what is public, what is not public, where there may be accessible areas to allow you to put a boat on or a kayak or something along those lines. It's just really good to be able to identify the areas in your the waterways and the areas that are accessible to the public in your area, because honestly that's one of the most important things is being able to identify water that you can fish but is productive and doesn't have a ton of other people there fishing it. In my neck of the woods, a lot of the dams on the rivers are some of the most popular places to fish because there's a ton of accessible water. The problem is, depending on the time of the year, you may not even be able to find a place to fish. There's just that many people that are fishing them. So it's really important as a bank angler to try to identify the areas that you can fish so that you have areas that are accessible. But more than anything, if you go to the first spot, if there's somebody there, you got other spots to go to. So I think that's very, very important. For me, spent tons and tons of time doing it when I was younger. And that was always one of the best things was being able to find the water that you could fish. So that's the first biggest tip I can give to any bank angler is to spend the time looking at maps to identify where you can fish to begin with. Now, once you've done that, there's kind of two approaches to bank fishing, in my opinion. There's the sit and wait approach, which means you're going to kind of post up in a spot and hope that you've got fish that are coming to you. Those are generally going to be your travel routes. The other approach is to cover as much water as possible, and you're really going hunting for the fish versus letting them come to you. So you've got to to keep in mind like a lot of different things, right? Like the spot that you are going to fish, does it set up as a travel route or is it more of like this is where a fish lives? I'm going to go fish that. In my head I can think of places like dams or river swings or bridges where you can kind of go and set up shop and wait for the fish to come to you because it's a travel route. But then there's a lot of other places I can think of where it's like, man, I can go to this park, walk this shoreline, and I know that there's four stumps along that shoreline that are probably the high percentage areas where the bass are going to be. If I don't catch them off those 4 stumps, probably not gonna catch much in that area, so I might as well move on. So I'm really trying to cover as much ground as possible. So whether that was, riding a bike or driving around in a car or my freshman year in college, I actually was on rollerblades. Kind of embarrassed to admit that, but yeah, I was a guy rollerblading down a park with a fishing rod, and I would fish in my rollerblades. I mean, that's how dedicated I guess I was, or goofy looking I probably was, but uh, it was all about okay, I'm gonna cover a ton of water, and so you kind of got to recognize what is that spot good for? Is it a sit and wait because it's a travel route, or is it simply you're really going to where the fish live? So there's those two approaches. In my opinion, you're probably better off uh, if you've got a good time of season, so a time of year where the fish are moving around, and that happens quite a bit in the spring, where if you can identify a place where you can sit and wait, you have the better opportunity of catching a lot more fish. But that's not always the case all year round. In the spring, if you've got a bridge that sets up where the fish are moving back into a spawning area, it's a great location. But in the summer months, a lot of times that travel route of that bridge isn't going to be quite as good because the fish have already either move in or move out of where they were going and coming from. Uh, so that's one of the keys just to keep in mind anytime you're bank fishing. Once you've identified the type of spot that you have, that's when you can start making your decision on bait choices. Now, for me, when I was doing a lot of bank fishing, I kind of really kept it simple. I generally like to fish slower because, I didn't want to pull up to a spot and throw a vibrating jig and make 5 casts and pick up and leave and go to the next one. I generally felt like I had more success by fishing slower with weedless type presentations. I generally didn't throw many crankbait style baits or I should say treble hook style baits, unless I was fishing it more like in a suspended manner, which may have been more like a lipless crankbait or a jerk bait. But plastics seemed to be more of my friend. I threw a lot of jigs too at the same time where I could drag it and feel the bottom, figure out how deep I was, whether there was any cover around, and still be relatively weedless. But that's kind of one of the things. Anytime you're fishing from shore, you are usually in a better position to have a weedless bait just from the standpoint of not losing stuff continuously. Obviously, if you're dragging things on the bottom, you're dragging uphill because you're on shore, so you're always bringing your bait up. That's usually um, a better way to get snagged. So from that perspective, I would almost always go with as light of bait as possible. But if you're dragging things on the bottom, you're probably going to get stuck. So you just need to be aware of that. And from that standpoint, I usually went with gear that was, um, just more less expensive. I would say I generally wasn't throwing really expensive stuff. Um, but the bait choice is really key from a standpoint of being productive in the areas that you're fishing. So, if you're fishing a bridge and you're throwing a jig, you're probably getting stuck in the riprap nonstop. So, from that standpoint, I would usually switch to something more along the lines of a drop shot where hopefully I was only breaking the weight off versus breaking the bait off. Or I would be fishing an extremely lightly weighted Texas rig that I felt like I could flutter up the rocks versus let get down inside of the rocks. Just something to keep in mind. And I'm sure if you're a bank fisherman, that's not necessarily news to you, but it is something just to keep in mind. Uh, the best spots for me almost always were areas where I could find something that was unique to the shoreline. So a channel swing bank, or a undercut bank, or maybe you had a point, or maybe you had a rock transition. Any of the things you'd really be looking for if you were fishing from boat are the same things that you're going to be looking to fish from shore. Now, I will also add, if you have the capability of wearing waders, or maybe it's warm enough where you could just throw on a pair of like old shoes, you could be much more productive by actually fishing from in the water and going down the bank from that standpoint. I mean, one of my favorite things to do is fish small streams during the warm part of the year where you're just wading the stream, and it's just a refreshing, relaxing way to fish. And in some instances, you're catching tons and tons of fish because a lot of times those smaller bodies of water are a lot less fish than other things, especially if you got to walk your way into them by using access through the water. So those are just a few of the tips that I have for you. I I probably went 10 or 15 years without doing much bank fishing at all, but I will say I do a lot more of it again, being that I'm with my boys, and I think it's valuable to get them out and walking around, even if it's not even fishing that much. I mean, we walk the banks just looking for baits and letting boys be boys. But I do. There's something special about bank fishing that I think I'll always do. One other tip too. Now that I'm thinking about it, you don't always have the ability to choose the species that you want to fish as productively as you would be if you were in a boat. Meaning, if you're talking warm summer months and there's a lot of bass that are offshore that time of year, they might just not be as accessible to you from the bank. So a lot of times what I would actually do is end up switching tactics for different species that might be more accessible. So, as an example, off the shoreline here, I'll catch a lot of just catfish and carp and suckers and smallmouth mixed in just by throwing crawlers on three-way river rigs off the bank. I don't because I only have the bank, I'm much more willing to kind of just broaden my horizon and fish for different species than just trying to key in specifically on bass, which may be harder to catch at certain times of the year based on where I can fish from. So it's important to keep in mind that you can have really productive days on the water catching fish. It just may not always be the most targeted species for you. But because you're limited to certain spots on the shore, sometimes you just got to settle for what you can catch. Anyways, I hope this answers some of the questions. I get so many questions about bank fishing. I know a lot of you guys out there that watch the channel on a regular basis don't have boats and don't have accessibleness to a lot of the lakes and rivers. So hopefully this helped you guys. If so, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.